Welcome everyone for another Risk and Margin Talks, and coming to you from Granby, Colorado on a beautiful Colorado mountain day. And with me is Schelly Olson. And Schelly, and we are both vaccinated, and we have
at least 3 feet.
At least 3 feet. We're closer to 5.5. So Schelly's the Assistant Fire Chief at Grand Fire Protection District, #1. And she's also Public Information Officer, PIO, on an incident management team. And she's also one of my MCS teammates on our cadre. And so all those things made me think that she'd have a really good perspective on risk. And then the other thing that happened, so last summer we had the East Troublesome fire here in Colorado, and it was a bad fire. And you worked that fire for, 30, 40, 45 days without
Well, it was the
a break.
Williamsport fire that first started in the summer, and I worked on that for almost 50 days.
50 days
Yep.
straight and no time off. So finally, fire behavior, predictions looking good. And so she takes some time off and goes out of state, and fire behavior changes. And while she's gone, her house burns down, right? Which makes you the third MCS cadre member who's lost their family home in a wildfire. So that's a club you don't want to belong to. But so anyway, I thought those would be really unique perspectives because, more of that strategic kind of risk in your day job and the operational and tactical risk in the incident management team world. And then obviously the individual risk, living in the mountains, there's a lot of hazards, the wildland urban interface, and a lot of other stuff that can happen in the mountains. So with that, maybe tell just a little bit about your journey to these places that you're at, that you have these risk perspectives. How'd you get here?
Sure. So at Grand Fire, as the assistant chief here, one of my main responsibilities is community risk reduction.
Okay, yeah.
So when we talk about risk reduction using the 5 E's, education being some of it, I have been working on that for the last 10 years. Fire safety both inside the home and outside the home as far as wildfire risk is concerned. So been doing that for a very long time. So it is one of those things where it's really ironic that the one person who's been speaking on wildfire preparedness and prevention for so long loses their home in a wildfire.
Although, to be fair,
yes,
right? I mean, I think in California, Southern California, we always, think of 300-foot flame lengths, crossing the interstate. But now that's normal in Northern California, and that has been very normal here, where it wouldn't matter what you had done.
That is correct.
Right? I mean, these aren't normal WUI wildfires.
And I think that is probably where my message going forward to my community members, don't give up. Don't stop doing that risk reduction.
Yeah, because most fires are going to be normal, right? We're not seeing the 400-year fire every fire.
Right.
We're just seeing it every 10 fires.
Well, yeah, and that's where we come up with the term the mega fire, over 100,000 acres. And yes, not all of them are going to be like that. We have had a lot of small fires. We put out 98% of them less than an acre. But it's those really big firestorms that just change everything. And I think it's going to change our community's perception of risk, because they need to know we only burned, it was 200,000 acres approximately in 2020. There's another 80% of this county with beetle kill timber that is going to burn somehow, some way, sometime. So we have to continue our journey on.
Well, that's so in your mind, just for you personally, right, how your brain works, how do you define risk? And I know you've got a lot of different kinds of risk, but in your mind, how do you define that?
In my mind, I define risk as that likelihood or probability that a hazard, like fire, flood, will negatively impact me or my community.
Okay.
I think that's where I view risk.
Which would apply regardless of your level or, personal or...
Yeah, and another way of maybe capture that is, how much risk are you willing to take? So how much are you willing to do around your property and your home to make it safer for wildfire?
Well, because that's the gain side, right?
Right.
So often and what's one of the reasons that we are having so many of these conversations around risk. In the emergency management world, it doesn't define the gain as well or as quantifiably as it tries and defines the risk. And so, you understand the risk, but if you don't understand the gain, so from a community scale, from a homeowner scale, from a incident management team, so how do you consider yourself to be a risk taker?
Well, I can talk to that in a couple different ways. I don't think I'm a very big risk taker. I like to play things safe, not a gambler. But I do have to say, and I'll mention this because, we are first responders.
Mm-hmm.
We have seen a lot of trauma. I just now went through a lot of trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the symptoms of going through trauma like that is your risk level changes. You're all of a sudden, oh my goodness, I've just lost everything. I've lost my home. Childhood memories of my children were there. And now I'm just throw caution to the wind and maybe I'll drive too fast. Or maybe I will, I don't know, drink too much, something like that. You just have to watch those things when you have gone through some trauma like that.
That's a really good perspective. I mean, I've lived that dream many, 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 many times. Because I was reading this great book, actually sent it to you, The Hour Between the Dog and the Wolf, right?
Oh, yeah.
And they talk about how after a really bad trauma, that actually a lot of people will become risk averse, more risk averse. Okay. Although I can see,
both sides of that.
So it's risk averse in their job, but then where that gets pushed to maybe risk taking in these other areas, like you're saying, acting out or having sex or drinking too much or
things that are hazardous,
all those
to you.
things, right? That are hazardous. That's really
no. But I agree with what you're saying too, Mark. That I would say that risk averse also comes in too, because now I'm thinking no matter what happens, I'm going to move into a new house and it's going to burn down.
Right.
I mean, something's going to happen. So you just are very cognizant of that. And, now we have a home that we moved into and there's trees and I would like to cut some down, and I'm sure my husband doesn't want to cut them down because, like you said, the benefit of doing it, you don't realize that as much. You're like, well, okay, maybe my view is a little bit better, but it's a lot of work to mitigate and reduce risk for wildfire.
Well, trees do put off things that boost your immune system.
So we should keep
you know what I mean? So we got COVID, we can't get rid of all the trees.
We got lots of aspens, I love those.
Well, so it's how risky is your job? Or I know, your jobs.
Yeah.
I mean, how risky is it then?
It depends on what we're talking about, which hat I'm wearing. When I talk about community risk reduction, in the firehouse, I'd say that's pretty safe. It's not as risky. You may risk, alienating a group of some sort when you're trying to do some education. And I think especially now with talk of what are we going to do after this wildfire? What are we going to change? And some of that is wildland urban interface building codes.
Right.
And that might not be the conversation that they want to have. So those types of things. But I think, as a firefighter, as a responder, you know what our risk is. Driving to the incident is going to be the riskiest thing we do. And then, of course, inherently our job is hazardous. So I think,
So that's interesting because, obviously all the studies, both I would think in fire rescue, like structural fire, and certainly in wildfire, I mean, driving is the number one killer.
Yep.
So most people wouldn't start their careers thinking driving is the number one killer.
I know. I wouldn't think so.
I mean, so what was the difference between what you thought the risks were going to be when you first got into the job versus like that perspective that is obviously informed by a lot of science and data and figures?
Well, starting out as a volunteer firefighter, probably 16 years ago, I would say I thought the biggest risk was going to be, being on an ambulance and, sticking someone with a needle, or you're sticking yourself with a needle, being infected with something, that you wanted to avoid. So those types of things, those hazardous on the job pieces, slips, trips, and falls are huge,
Right.
especially in Grand County with the ice, and getting out of an apparatus when it's slippery and things like that. But, I guess, I thought maybe it would be more those types of things, but you're right. Like, it is driving to an incident, driving home, that are really big risks.
And that really, I'm not going to go too deep into that, but I mean, that's the subjective nature that we usually bring as intuitive risk decision makers. And often if we forget the quantifying of risk and the attempt to quantify risk in a subjective world, because those numbers would never come out if we didn't actually look at statistics and try to quantify that.
I think I can give you a really good example of a friend of mine who witnessed a helicopter crash on a fire, and the helicopter pilot was transporting water and Gatorade.
Right.
So you look at that and say, you're putting the pilot in the air on a risky flight, because that is
aviation is inherently risky.
To deliver, water.
Logistics.
Exactly. And, then you have to kind of go back and say, well, with these life-saving efforts, they needed water and Gatorade out there.
Was there any other way to get the water and Gatorade to keep that crew productive? What were the values at risk on that division, let's say, if it's a wildfire, where, they're working to protect? Is it a critical, or is it not critical, or is it just a Tuesday and we could have just driven it up?
Yeah, and making any mistakes if you drop off, in a spike camp, something that's meant for another spike camp. Now there's another flight involved. Yeah. So those types of risks we have to weigh.
And most people outside, going back to the community, I mean, how do they perceive risk differently than you perceive risk? Because they're just like, I need a fire, I need an engine at my home, right? They're not calculating all that,
How risky that is. I think that we actually did a study, and we've got some results back. We did 5.
Dang, you can get this is good.
We did 5 different neighborhoods. We did a rapid hazard assessment of their home, looking at 11 attributes of wildfire, susceptibility. And then we sent them a survey. And the survey was tied to some of the attributes and also their wildfire risk perceptions. Like, do you think,
interesting,
a wildfire?
So comparing what your professional assessment was versus their homeowner intuitive.
Exactly. So the thing I think is really exciting about this, we just got the results. We're working with a research team to interpret the results, but one of the communities, 28 homes burned. So let's do a survey
and see where
where their perceptions have changed.
Oh, fascinating.
So I personally, in my experience working with communities, people want to do more to reduce surveys, right? They saw what happened.
If it's practical, if they can afford it, if they can, but if they can, they want to do it, right?
Yes, and I think that, witnessing firsthand 366 homes being destroyed in Grand County really is pushing folks to get some things done. Now, we also, in that research, found out what are the barriers to mitigating and reducing your risk. In one community, the biggest barrier was they want to know specifically what needs to be done. So that really is a one-on-one, let's talk to you, look at your property, and assess the hazards. So that's another step. But the funding and money for it was last on the list, which I thought was interesting.
That is
interesting. A lot of people, but it was really, you have to look at the demographics, the average age of the folks, and just physically doing the work and not knowing exactly what to do. So
because obviously people that are working, especially in the mountains. I mean, mountain communities, they can do that work themselves, right? It's not like it's San Ramon, California, or something. I mean, they can go. They've got chainsaws. They can do a lot of that work.
But 65% of our folks are single homeowners.
Yeah.
And they want to come up and enjoy.
Yeah. And they're not physically here.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so That's interesting. So, and you can pick which perspective of the many hats you wear to answer this, but talk to me about how do people perceive risk changing real time? So that's probably more incident context, maybe, but
It does seem like that. That's a good question. I think we go back to the point we made before, that reward side of it is not so obvious and evident until something happens.
yeah,
So I would say, maybe, doesn't change as quickly, but then when something does happen, there's a force to change. But as far as, looking at incidents, being on an incident management team, you really have to weigh all of your decision making, based on those risks. And I think what we need to do as practitioners is to make sure people are trained and educated and are able to make critical decisions in the heat of the moment during an incident as things rapidly change.
Yeah.
Because they do.
yeah, and I think, if I know, just for as an example, right? If I know I am protecting the last, 5,000-year-old bristlecone on the planet, then I know when anything changes, that's what I'm going to compare it to. Right. That's the value I'm going to compare it to, because that's the game, right? And if it's just a single cabin, or if it's George Washington's cabin or Abe Lincoln's cabin, I will then immediately recalculate and say, okay, it's still worth it, or okay, we're done, let's go.
Right, and I think that's part.
But you have to have the game clearly defined.
You
right?
do, especially being in the information side of things, that really communicating that to folks.
Yes.
That
from the PIO perspective.
From the PIO perspective, right. Because if you do have folks that believe that there will be a fire truck at every home, and laying that, it's kind of not correct, right? It's not possible to have that many resources to protect every home. And so we need to put the responsibility back on them.
Yeah.
So if there is not a fire truck at your house can stand and do that. So we have to make sure that we are constantly educating the public on, we're not going to risk a firefighter's life to put them in harm's way. Just like in my neighborhood, they could not be in my neighborhood.
Right.
There was one way in, one way out, and it was intense, and they had to pull back.
Yeah.
And they weren't going to risk, and absolutely they should not.
Yeah. Right.
We got everybody out, thank goodness. So
that's victory.
it was victory, absolutely, to evacuate Grand Lake, and no one was injured, or there were no accidents on the highway.
Yeah.
Very big win.
Well, so what's a time that you remember where you went from thinking victory to like when your risk profile just changed like that, and you realized we just went from an okay thing to something really awful?
Well, I'm going to have to go with, I would have to go with what happened at the East Troublesome the day it blew up.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so it started on a Wednesday, but it then blew up on the next Wednesday. So here we have this small-ish wildfire near Parshall and Kremling, west in the county. And my friends from the Forest Service called and say, hey.
Well, and we had multiple fires, multiple going fires in Colorado.
Oh, yeah, Cameron Peak,
right.
Mullen, all of them. Yeah, we had lots of things going on and lots of resources being utilized. So they called and said, can you help out on this fire? And I said, no, I really need to get out of town, right? We told that story. So I left and then was out of town when the East Troublesome blew up. I would say, my risk profile changed because, here I'm now, I'm going to say a victim at the time. We're survivors, right? We're not victims.
Absolutely right.
For sure. But, I am suffering from this hazard personally. And I think, at that point, maybe you say to yourself, well, why aren't you in there? Well, why aren't you saving my house? Why aren't you, so I'm.
Or the guilt of why am I not there? Right?
Absolutely, guilt, 100%. That's a big thing to deal with.
Yeah.
And why am I not there? And what could I be doing to help? And yeah, that whole day and night, and it was really took place just over an evening, was I think changed that profile for me. And you have to step back and realize that safety is the number one. And I was so selfish, I think, in thinking, why aren't they calling me back? Why aren't they telling me what's happening? Well, I'm sorry, Schelly, but there were 366 homes.
You are one homeowner. You're a homeowner now. You're this, but and it's switching that role, right? Yeah.
It was. So that was hard, and I think, that was.
Well, and you go from now you're the IC. You're the incident commander of this whole incident of your own personal life, right? And so you got to switch into mission mode. You are going through what a survivor goes through. You're going through trauma, but you can't. You have to stay switched on. You have to focus on these are the next three things. You have to set your priority. I mean, it's just having gone through this similar experience, I can tell you that's exactly what my mental model was. Is now I'm the IC of this big incident. Because in my case, we had fatalities, we had all kinds of stuff, right? So, but that's and I didn't wall off the grief or the emotion. I used to, like early in my career, with the drinking and everything like that. But I did have to put it in a box. And then at the right time, take it out of the box and let it
deal with it.
Process it, right?
I think I felt that really strongly as well, dealing with what I was going through. But my first thing was, we were in a hotel in Denver because there was nowhere to be up here. Everything else was on pre-evacuation. Didn't want to put ourselves in that situation.
Right.
But I could not sleep. I could not do anything. I had to be back here in my gear, driving out to the scene, taking it in. And then the next couple days, helping others go through their neighborhoods escorting them in to see if their house was there, if not, getting them some closure,
Well, and that's a really good point. I mean, because survivors cannot progress without situation awareness, without context.
Right.
So I totally get, I have to go see it. I mean, you're a firefighter. I get that. And this was a fire. But if it was a flood, you would have felt the exact same compulsion to see it, to experience it, because survivors can't move forward without that.
Right.
And I remember we had the Engine 57 burnover back in 2006, and we worked with that incident management team. And 5 firefighters were ultimately killed, 4 on scene, 1 died in the hospital. And there was this huge debate about, do we take the families to the fatality site? What do we do? What do we do? And it had only been a few months since my family's home burned down and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, yes, there is no risk. Of the many risks in doing that doesn't outweigh the gain. Yeah. The gain outweighs every potential risk here. And, I felt very fortunate to have a clear understanding of it at that time.
Yeah, that did change the way you did your job.
Yeah. So I totally get what you're saying.
Had to be there.
Yeah.
And tried to, help your community members too, just because you have that guilt that you weren't there. I wanted to make sure I was there when they were doing some of the reentry processes.
Yeah. So. And so is that guilt rational? Is that a rational feeling? Where does that come from?
Rational to me, right?
It seems like it. But what do you think it is about our kinds of worlds where that guilt hits home when you're not there?
It's not going to happen to me. Yeah. Maybe a type of feeling. I just, I've worked on many fires. I've seen many people evacuate. I have seen houses burn, but it's not going to happen to my house.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, that's just a human thought that you're just in that place where you just don't think it can happen to me, that optimism bias, right? And we talked a little bit before how, do as I say, not as I do, right? So did my husband sign up for the emergency notifications? No. Did my husband want to cut trees down to reduce risk? Did he?
Well, his calculus, right, was different than yours.
Did he have, was he able to pack anything in the car? And when everybody was, packing a week earlier, but not in our zone, right? But you kind of think, well, you know what, this could happen to me. I might want to get ready. So I think I have a lot of, I don't know if it's guilt, anger, resentment.
Or all of the above.
Or all of the above, that I didn't, make more of a difference at my own home to help that. So I think that's part of the guilt.
And it's interesting too, because you talked about that optimism bias, and like all traits. I mean, I don't know how we could succeed in chaos without being optimists.
Yes.
You have to be, right? And yet, like all strengths, if you click them over 2 clicks too far, they become a weakness.
Yes.
So how do you know when one of your strengths is now a risk?
Right? Because you can go just too far of you're not able to live. And if I were to think that now that this house is going to burn down, that's going to be paralyzing. Having the box sitting at the front door every day, and it's just gotta look at that.
Well, so that how do you balance that risk versus gain? So like, as a homeowner, you talked about that, right? It's sort of like you have to unified command, right? You have with your family members,
yes.
You sort of have to, but particularly in your day job where you're looking at community scale risk,
right?
You can't have it all. So how in your approach, what's your internal calculus for balancing the risk versus gain for the whole community?
Sure. And like you say, it is individual homeowner based, but also community based. And I think that, having actively engaged and communicating communities, right there, I think reduces some risk because people become very tight knit. I think that was one thing I noticed during these fire episodes, that the HOAs and the communities just became so much tighter and closer and more communicative. And that's a big strength, and I think a big risk reducer.
Because even if they're not on board or they're talking, they're communicating, that cohesion is there, which builds resilience, right?
Absolutely.
And resilience is margin.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's one of the things we talk about, right? Is creating, how do you create margin? So like, just continue with your thought there, because what you just said is one of the ways you create margin at a community scale. So what are some other ways that you try to create margin?
Sure. I think now, having what happened to me, I can now tell the story.
Yeah. That is your story.
That is my story. And, folks, I know you might not want to.
So you might be there in your uniform with your badge and you're them at the big community meeting and everybody, but you're not them. You're us.
I'm you guys. I've been there, and I know what you're going through right now. And then also on the front side of it, on the preparedness and mitigation side, I know what you guys need to be doing. And, let's talk about this. Like I've said for years to, file your important papers and put them in the cloud. And, did we do that? Maybe not.
But I bet you.
I'm going to do it now, right?
You're doing it now.
I mean, now people are like, well, what do I do? Do I get a fire safe box? I'm like, well, absolutely not. A fire safe box in a wildfire doesn't do anything.
Yeah.
Put them in a safe deposit box, scan them into the cloud.
Yeah.
Have them easily accessible, because those are things they take a lot of effort to get back.
Yeah.
Now, photos and memorabilia and heirlooms are another story. I mean, you want them out and to be able to enjoy them, not tucked away in a box in the day.
No, but in our experience, we scanned. That was one of the first things I did after the immediate aftermath. We scanned in all that stuff, all the stuff that was salvaged. Firefighters did a great job of salvaging things that they knew were important, and we scanned it all in, and
it's a good start.
So I really love that concept where your story now creates margin for others, because that's what stories are all about in our world, is making the mistake. Let me tell you about a lesson that you don't have to step into that minefield yourself to learn.
Well, I think, you recommended Sandra Younger Miller's book, Fire Outside My Window. And if I had read that last year, I wouldn't have taken her words like I did when I just finished it after this fire. It just impacted me in a totally different way. And I think, we always talk about our libraries and reading. And if you have, prior to an incident, read a book, and then after an incident, read a book, you're looking at it as in a whole nother, lens. And, I think that people who have gone through it are really good advocates and mentors for the folks who are having it happen to them next.
Yeah, well, that's like any of us, right?
Yeah.
We take the only value from a tragedy, whether it's my mistake, your mistake. It could have just been something as simple as I broke, or I left a thermos on the apparatus and we got a call and off we went and this thing, flattened a tire or some whatever.
Yeah.
Some little lesson, a mistake, you turn that into a story and now it becomes a strength, in the crew as a whole.
Yes. I agree.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. Schelly, this has been like really cool. Wave at the folks at home.
Hey, everybody.
If you've watched all of this, you're like us. You don't have real lives. You're like this risk and, chaos, nerd or junkie. But anyway, Schelly, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Mark.
I really appreciate this opportunity to talk with you.
Absolutely. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity and for coming to visit us in Grand County.
Yeah.